Good morning, everybody. Good, in this case, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Jimmy Henderson, a cognitive scientist, metaphysician, and I've been asked once again to give you a talk for the Wellness Lifestyle Festival, and I'm very happy to do so. Today I'm going to be talking about consciousness, and in other words, the metaphysical concept of consciousness, and what I believe to be 4 levels or stages in consciousness. Before I begin, I'll introduce you to my puppy support, author support puppy from our publisher. Thank you. His name is number 1. And I also want to introduce you to my new book, Metaphysics, Understanding Metaphysics, Using Psychology to Better Understand Metaphysical Experiences. Right, I'll talk a bit more about that book later on. This talk actually comes from the book, so it's quite, if you really want to get the book later on, that'll be fine. Right, I see personal growth as actually a growth in consciousness. The consciousness in metaphysics is not just self-awareness. We see it as an energy state, feeding through the brain and activating ourselves, our life and energy. And that is the metaphysical view of consciousness. And to me, personal growth is basically a growth in consciousness. In other words, our consciousness is unfolding more and more through our biological structures until it reaches the maximum height of consciousness, which is possible for us as human beings. Let me give you an analogy to explain what I mean. The analogy of the caterpillar, which I've given in a previous book. In the beginning, the caterpillar is an egg, then it's a larva, then it's a crawling caterpillar who is pretty destructive. It eats everything in its path, very selfish and self-destructive. Well, not self-destructive, destructive to our plants and to our plants and flowers. But later on, it becomes a chrysalis, and then it becomes a butterfly or a moth. In other words, it undergoes a transformation a transformation which we could then compare to the transformation of consciousness that takes place in the human being. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the 4 stages of consciousness, which I've identified in my latest book, and perhaps you'll agree with me, perhaps you won't. That's fine. You'll notice that I do refer a lot to evolutionary processes. I regard myself as an evolutionary scientist, cognitive scientist, which means that I don't believe that we descended from monkeys, but that we did go through a process of evolutionary growth and change, as we do during our consciousness. So, while I'm talking about consciousness now, I'm going to be saying that consciousness is actually a continuum which starts from self-awareness, the moment of self-awareness, and takes us right through to the highest level of human consciousness, which is possible, which in psychology would be self-actualization consciousness, or I call it intuitive consciousness. Let's see as we go along. I will try and use science and psychology as far as possible, because make it more acceptable to you, because that is the approach that I use in all my books and articles. Okay, the first stage of consciousness, as I see it, could be, I define as an instinctual consciousness. This is the mark of early man who has not yet achieved full self-awareness and who is basically just acting on instinct. There was no language or thought involved at that stage because the brain had not evolved sufficiently to support language or to reflect on itself and become self-aware. So probably our consciousness and thinking was limited to crude realization, moments of crude realization based on associations. What I mean by associations is, let me give you an example. We can imagine a caveman being cornered by a saber-toothed tiger. and realizing this association with death. Okay, he's seen this animal kill others, kill other animals, kill other cavemen and his companions. So he's aware, he's conscious of the fact that this animal is dangerous. He can't think his way out of it quite clearly. He's acting purely on instinctual consciousness, and he knows he needs to escape. There's no long-term planning or thinking involved at this stage. When it comes to people, let's have a look at this in real life. Do we still have this kind of consciousness in real life? In today's modern world? Yes, unfortunately we do. There are cases, let me talk about tremendously powerful emotions, such as rage and frustration and anger, can cause the person's consciousness to lower. In other words, consciousness can move up or can move down depending on our state of mind and our behavior, what we are doing. Now, when we have mob psychology, where we've got a huge group of people together and they are venting their anger and frustration, we can call that unthinking behavior. Because basically it's mindless actions taking place. These people are not really thinking as to what they're doing or the implications of what they're doing. They're just acting out their natural instincts for survival or for, whatever you would like to call it. It's natural instincts and drives which were present in the early man, and are still present, can still come out under certain circumstances, such as with these powerful emotions, or otherwise intoxication. We often see that very drunk people also do mindless things and crazy things which they would not normally do. So the alcohol or the drugs have actually lowered their consciousness to a point where they're not really thinking, and they're acting once again purely on instinct. Okay, let me take you then to the next level of human unfoldment, would be self-realization, language and thinking. In other words, the brain has developed to this point where we've got self-awareness, and there is thinking and consciousness as we would understand it. I call it a schematic consciousness. I'll explain that why. Unfortunately, at this stage, it's still a very selfish form of consciousness, because it's focused on the self and self's needs. And so I'm just checking something here. Yes, and a person caught up in this situation would be it would not be complex thinking. It would be schematic consciousness, in which people only think of themselves in terms of programs. Now, what I mean by programs is schemas and scripts. Now, schema is a very simple, habitual line of thought. If I do this, I must do that. If this person does this to me, I will do that. I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that. Very simple habits of thinking or programs, which are not really true independent thought. It's not really independent creative thought. It's basically just habits that we've made it easier for ourselves to think by thinking along these very simple lines. And yes, this is normally related to very rigid beliefs. As I say, rigid beliefs that have been built up from past experience. I've had this experience, therefore if I see this person or that animal, this is what I'm going to do. In other words, it's programmable. There's no real creative thought at this point. And we often see this today. Unfortunately, many people are still stuck at this level. And we see this when it comes to people speaking, talking, or giving their opinion on things. And we see the lack of depth in the thinking and consciousness, and it comes across as I called it well-worn slogans. In other words, just basically quoting stuff which goes around, comes around, that sort of thing. And political rhetoric, unfortunately, a lot of that as well, where these slogans are just quoted over and over and shouted over and over, but there's no real insight into what the implications are of those slogans or of that kind of thinking. The implications are ignored, and the person with the schematic consciousness focuses only on the self and their needs, and in terms of these little programs and habits and what they've learned from the past. So it can be very biased, because it's basically based on what they've learned, and they might not have had a full range of experiences, so it's a very limited experience, what I call experiential base to their thinking. And it actually forms an energy state of consciousness which is not good for creative thought. Okay, let me take you then onto the third stage. I call it cognitive consciousness. I think most people today function on this level, which is of true thinking. When due to education, as I say, the way one would overcome the schematic consciousness is usually through education and personal growth. You would have to undertake a course or path of personal growth, consciously try to improve yourself and your thinking, your understanding of the world, understanding of people, the implications of things, and your logical thought. And then you'd come to the state of cognitive consciousness, where, as a result of education and mental maturity, the person begins to think less selfishly. The focus moves away from the self and moves away to helping others as well. And at this level of consciousness, the people are able to think independently and creatively. And this can lead to self-discovery as well as other kind of discoveries and active participation in the world. Let me give you an example. This kind of person would be a person who has a good understanding of themselves, who's self-developed themselves in many ways, educational and EQ, IQ, and is able to work with others. An example of this, would be able to encourage others with new ideas. And an example of this would be a motivational speaker or manager who actually works with others and encourages them. And thinking in other words, starting to think out of the box. Thinking out of the box would be a high state of cognitive consciousness. While you're in the box, you're still schematic thinking. Out of the box, cognitive. We've moved on to the level of cognitive, which of course means the front area of the brain, which means you are using the more advanced forms of thinking and reasoning. Okay, I'm going to come to the last stage now, which I've listed, which I call intuitive consciousness. All this pre-programmed thinking and reasoning gives way to a knowledge of deeper universal principles. In other words, there's far more to life than just work and just things in the world. There's underlying principles and laws which we need to be aware of, which we can work with. This could also be developed through study and through especially a deeper understanding of philosophy and metaphysics, when your mind is now stretched and your consciousness is challenged to grow to new levels. And it brings a deeper understanding, and what it also brings is compassion for others. Remember I mentioned earlier on that the early types of consciousness are very self-focused. The first one, instinctual, is very destructive in a way because it's so selfish, the selfish ways. Where the second, schematic, is still selfish to a degree, focused on one's own needs. Where the cognitive consciousness, one starts to move the focus to other people and assist them as well. At the level of intuitive consciousness, we put people, in this case, who would be the world servers, light workers, people who are engaged in selfless service to others all over the world on different levels. And The way one would develop this is as I said, through study of metaphysical principles, philosophies, and basically acting out this love and benevolence which we start to feel. One should start to feel more love and benevolence as one moves the focus from self to the outside world and to the brotherhood of man. We should then automatically feel this compassion and a need to assist and the wish to assist others. Yeah, there is a hope for the future. The signs are good. There seems to be a moral advancement in consciousness, and there seems to be a new global consciousness coming about. People are becoming more involved in human rights issues and animal rights issues and calling for ecological change. This change has been noticeable. Unfortunately, it's not a widespread. The change is not taken off all over the world, but there are groups of people who are striving for this, for the deeper forms of consciousness and service. Okay, in closing, I want to mention one other level, which I haven't discussed in this book, is this level of soul consciousness for those of you that are spiritually inclined. The soul, which we in metaphysics see more, and not just as a concept, but as a real source of energy, the real essence of the person. And this can be reached under certain circumstances during advanced meditations and contemplations, other metaphysical exercises. The higher consciousness of the soul will actually start coming through, which is actually beyond the intuitive, but it feeds the intuitive level, the soul. So once we start connecting with soul, we are feeding the intuitive consciousness and mind. So I hope that you've enjoyed that talk. I hope I haven't been too boring. Just once again, I want to just point out my book, my latest book, Understanding Metaphysics, explaining psychology, using psychology to better understand metaphysical experiences. The book is available from Amazon.com. It's available from Fiona van Rensburg at the Portal of Alchemy, and it's also available on other sales platforms, and also through my website, which you're most welcome to visit. There are articles there, other articles and talks which you might, videos which you might find useful. My website address is www.discoveringyourself.co.za. Once again, I want to thank you for your time.